Sun's up again out here, same as it's been the last couple episodes. 2 chapters into this new book, an honest number faced directly, an untested belief actually put to the test. This one is where the book stops talking about facing hard truths and starts showing what it actually looks like to act on one, every single day for months, toward a goal that everyone around him said couldn't be done in the time available. The chapter is called The Impossible Task, and the impossible task in question was almost absurdly literal. A specific amount of weight, over 100 pounds, that needed to disappear in roughly 3 months to even qualify for a shot at Navy SEAL training. Doctors he consulted along the way didn't hedge about it. They called it unrealistic, potentially dangerous, if actually attempted on that timeline, the kind of thing nobody serious would recommend trying. He tried anyway, and I want to spend this whole episode on how, because the how is where this chapter actually earns its title. This isn't a story about a single dramatic decision. It's a story about what sustained daily execution towards something everyone agreed was impossible actually looks like hour by hour, day by day, and what it reveals about where the word impossible actually comes from in the first place. It's worth sitting with the raw scale of that number for a second before moving on, because the specifics matter here more than they usually do. 100 pounds isn't a stretch goal or an ambitious quarter. It's closer to rebuilding an entire body from the inside out, on a clock that left almost no room for anything going even slightly wrong along the way. Most transformation stories, told after the fact, smooth over exactly how narrow that margin actually was. This chapter doesn't. It sits inside the narrowness deliberately, because the narrowness is the whole reason the mechanics matter as much as they do. Here's the reframe this chapter is built around, and it connects directly to the untested internal stories from the last episode, just scaled up to an entire goal instead of single belief. Impossible, in the way it usually gets used, rarely means what it claims to mean. Most of the time, it means nobody has yet attempted the task with full, sustained, rigorously tracked effort, and the word is doing the work of explaining that absence rather than describing an actual physical ceiling. Asterisk, asterisk, the doctors weren't lying when they called the weight loss timeline unrealistic. They were describing what happens under normal effort, applied inconsistently, without obsessive tracking, the way almost everyone actually approaches a difficult goal. What they weren't accounting for, because it's genuinely rare, was what happens when every single variable gets controlled for and every single day gets treated as its own complete battle rather than one data point in a general trend. I want to walk through the actual mechanics of how this gets done, because the chapter is specific about them, and the specifics are what make the difference between an inspiring idea and something actually usable. The first mechanic is obsessive daily tracking, not a general sense of progress, but literal, specific numbers, checked constantly, treated as the only source of truth about how the effort was actually going. Vague daily impressions lie. A precise number, checked at the same time every day under the same conditions, doesn't have that luxury. The word obsessive is doing real work in that sentence, and it's worth not softening it into something more comfortable. This wasn't a weekly check-in or a casual glance at an app once in a while. It was daily, sometimes more than daily, treated with a seriousness that would look, from the outside, almost excessive for an ordinary goal. That level of attention wasn't decoration. It was the entire mechanism that made the third mechanic, refusing to let a bad stretch define the whole attempt, actually possible, because distinguishing a real plateau from ordinary noise requires exactly that density of data, not an occasional impression formed once a week. The second mechanic is breaking an enormous target into checkpoints small enough to actually be meaningful day to day, rather than one overwhelming distance measured against a 3-month deadline. This is the same idea from the last episode, resisting the urge to stare the full gap, but this chapter shows what it looks like sustained over months rather than described as a single principle. A checkpoint missed by a small margin on day 12 doesn't redefine the entire 90-day effort as a failure. It's simply information used to adjust the next few days, the same way any single data point gets used without being allowed to override the whole pattern. Asterisk, asterisk. The third mechanic, and I think the one this chapter actually cares about most, is refusing to let a single bad day, or even a genuinely bad stretch of several days, become the story of the whole attempt. There were periods across that 3-month window where progress stalled, with a body pushed back hard against what was being demanded of it, where by any reasonable measure quitting would have been the sane, defensible choice. The task got completed not because those stretches didn't happen, but because they never got treated as verdicts. Each one got absorbed as a temporary condition, addressed with whatever adjustment it actually called for. And then the tracking simply continued the next day, as if the plateau were just whether to be worked through rather than a wall that ended the whole project. There's a fourth mechanic worth adding, one the book treats almost as background, but that quietly held the other three together the whole time. Consistency of measurement conditions. Checking a number under wildly different circumstances each time, different times of day, different states of hydration or fatigue, produces noise that can look like a plateau even when real progress is happening underneath it. Or it can look like progress even when nothing has actually changed. Fixing the exact conditions of every single check, same time, same state, same method, is what let the daily tracking actually mean something instead of just producing a confusing scatter of numbers that told a different story depending on which day got looked at. Okay, let that mechanic settle for a second, because the next part is where this whole thing actually gets tested against a real life instead of staying theoretical. I want to bring this down to something closer to what this channel is actually built around, because a 100-pound weight loss deadline isn't the situation most people listening to this are facing, and pretending otherwise would miss the point. I have my own version of an impossible task, one that started almost as a joke to myself. A specific distance and pace combination that, given the injury history and the age this channel has always been honest about, several people, including one doctor, told me directly wasn't realistic to pursue seriously. I remember the exact conversation where that assessment landed hardest. You know how some conversations just stay with you, word for word, years later, sitting in an office being told plainly and not unkindly that the specific combination of distance and pace I had in mind was the kind of target usually reserved for younger runners without a history like mine, and that a more modest version would be a wiser use of the next year's training. That wasn't a careless dismissal. It was a genuinely reasonable, evidence-based assessment built on real patterns across real patients. It just happened to be exactly the kind of assessment this chapter argues shouldn't be treated as a final verdict without actually testing it first. I decided to actually track it the way this chapter describes, rather than the way I'd approached every previous ambitious goal, which was mostly vague enthusiasm followed by quiet abandonment somewhere around week 3. A specific number checked and logged every single day, not just on run days. A checkpoint set for each week, small enough that missing one wouldn't derail the whole attempt, but real enough that hitting it actually meant something. And a rule, stated clearly before starting, that no single bad week would be allowed to end the attempt on its own, that only a sustained pattern across several checkpoints, evaluated honestly rather than emotionally, would count as real evidence the goal wasn't achievable. There was a specific stretch close to the middle of that attempt where 3 consecutive weekly checkpoints came in below target, a real plateau, not an imagined one, the kind of stretch where the honest, reasonable voice starts making a genuinely convincing case for calling the whole thing off. I want to be direct about what actually happened in that stretch, because it wasn't some dramatic surge of willpower. It was almost boring by comparison. I looked at the actual numbers, adjusted one specific variable, a recovery week that had been skipped twice in a row, and kept tracking. The next 2 checkpoints came back on target. The plateau had been real, but it hadn't been the wall it felt like from inside it. It had been one specific, fixable input hidden inside what felt, emotionally, like the goal itself quietly announcing it had been impossible all along. That's the part of this chapter one think matters most for anyone chasing something that's been called unrealistic. The feeling of hitting an impossible wall and the reality of hitting a fixable, specific obstacle are almost indistinguishable from the inside in the moment, while a plateau is actually happening. The only way to tell them apart reliably is the tracking itself. Cold, specific numbers that don't share the emotional exhaustion of the person looking at them, capable of revealing a fixable variable that the tired, discouraged version of a person genuinely cannot see clearly in that moment. I think back to that specific week fairly often, actually because of how close it came to ending the whole attempt. If the tracking hadn't been in place, if the only available evidence had been the discouraged feeling rather than the actual numbers, that plateau would have been indistinguishable from genuine failure. And stopping there would have felt like the reasonable, mature response to real evidence rather than what it actually was, a premature surrender to a fixable input that hadn't yet been identified. The tracking didn't make the plateau less real. It just kept the exit open long enough to find the actual cause instead of accepting the first, most emotionally convincing explanation. There's a piece of this chapter worth naming directly, something the book states almost in passing, but that I think deserves real weight here. The mind tends to give up on a task long before the body has actually reached its genuine limit. That gap between where the mind first starts arguing for surrender and where the body's real capacity actually ends is enormous, far larger than most people ever discover, because most people stop the moment the mind's argument starts sounding reasonable without ever testing whether the argument was actually true. This connects back to the untested belief idea from last episode in a very specific way. This is impossible is itself exactly the kind of internal story that survives mostly because it's never actually been pushed against with full effort. The doctor's assessment wasn't wrong about what normal effort would produce. It was simply describing the results of an experiment that hadn't yet been run with the actual conditions this chapter describes. Obsessive tracking, checkpoint by checkpoint accountability, and a refusal to let any single discouraging stretch write the ending in advance. There's a reason this particular gap between mind and body gets discovered so rarely, worth naming before moving to the boundary this chapter needs. Discovering it requires staying in the discomfort of a genuine plateau long enough to find out whether the mind's argument for stopping was actually correct, and staying there is exactly what tracking makes possible and exhaustion alone makes nearly impossible. Without a system holding the effort accountable to something more durable than mood, the mind's argument almost always wins by default. Not because it's right, but because there's nothing else in the room strong enough to outlast it. I want to be careful here because this is exactly the kind of idea that can tip into something genuinely dangerous if it gets applied without real judgment, especially for anyone listening to a channel that's been honest from the very first episode about carrying real physical injuries. Not every task labeled impossible is actually a fixable plateau in disguise. Some limits are genuinely physical, confirmed by real evidence rather than assumption, and pushing straight through them isn't determination. It's recklessness wearing a costume borrowed from this chapter. The weight loss attempt in this book happened under close medical monitoring, adjusted along the way based on real signals from the body, not a blind refusal to acknowledge any feedback at all. The lesson here was never ignore every signal your body sends you. It was don't let the first uncomfortable signal or the first discouraging plateau get mistaken for the actual ceiling before it's genuinely been tested. The specific test worth applying before treating any goal as this chapter's kind of impossible task is roughly the same one from the last episode, just scaled up. Is the discouraging signal a piece of real physical evidence, or is it simply discomfort and doubt showing up on schedule, exactly the way they show up at the start of nearly every sustained effort regardless of whether the underlying goal is actually achievable? Real physical evidence, a genuinely worsening injury, a signal that's specific and consistent rather than vague and emotional. deserves respect and a real change in approach. Ordinary discomfort and doubt. The kind that shows up whether a goal is actually impossible or simply difficult, deserves exactly what this chapter recommends. Continued tracking, continued patience, and a refusal to let it write the ending before the data actually supports that conclusion. I want to add one more layer to that test, because the line between the two categories isn't always as clean as I've just made it sound, and pretending it always would be its own kind of dishonesty. Sometimes a signal starts as ordinary discomfort and genuinely shifts into real physical evidence somewhere along the way, which is exactly why the tracking has to include more than just a headline number. Watching for a small, specific set of warning signs alongside the main metric, sharp pain rather than general fatigue, a symptom that's getting consistently worse rather than staying flat, gives the tracking a second layer capable of catching that shift before it turns into a genuine injury, rather than only being useful for distinguishing plateaus from walls after the fact. So here's what this looks like as a practice, kept to one thing rather than scattered across several. The way this channel has approached every idea across both books so far. Pick one goal you've either quietly abandoned or never seriously attempted because it got labeled unrealistic somewhere along the way by a doctor, a friend, or simply your own tired assessment of yourself. Set a specific, trackable number for it, whatever version of a scale reading actually applies to your situation. Break the full distance to that goal into checkpoints small enough to check weekly rather than trying to hold the entire target in view at once. And set the rule this chapter's whole approach depends on before you start, in writing if possible. No single bad week ends the attempt. Only a genuine, sustained pattern across several checkpoints, evaluated with real numbers rather than a discouraged mood, counts as evidence worth actually listening to. I want to add one specific detail that made the difference for me, something worth naming clearly because it's easy to skip. Decide in advance exactly what a genuine sustained pattern actually looks like, a specific number of missed checkpoints in a row before starting, rather than deciding in the moment, exhausted and discouraged, whether this particular bad stretch counts as the real thing or just whether to work through. Deciding that threshold ahead of time, while thinking clearly, removes the decision from exactly the moment a person is least equipped to make it well. There's a second detail worth pairing with the first, aimed specifically at the warning sign layer covered a moment ago. Alongside the main checkpoint number, keep a short, specific list of the 2 or 3 signals that would actually count as real physical evidence rather than ordinary discomfort, written down in advance the same way the checkpoint threshold gets written down. Having that list ready means a genuine warning sign gets recognized quickly and respected immediately, rather than getting argued with in the moment the same way an ordinary plateau would be, because the two have already been clearly separated before either one actually shows up. I'll add one final piece to the practice. Since this is the 3rd episode into a new book and worth grounding clearly before moving forward, revisit the specific goal and its checkpoints roughly once a month, the same monthly rhythm covered in the last episode for reviewing the full size of a gap, and ask honestly whether the underlying assessment still holds. A goal that once looked unrealistic and has been proving itself achievable, checkpoint by checkpoint, deserves to have that progress acknowledged plainly, not just quietly assumed. And a goal that's genuinely revealing itself to be beyond what the body can safely handle through real, consistent evidence rather than ordinary discouragement, deserves the same honest look this whole series has asked for from its very first episode. Tomorrow morning, whatever's currently sitting in the category of impossible in your own life is very likely something closer to untested than actually confirmed. The doctors in this book weren't wrong about what normal effort produces. They just hadn't seen what obsessive tracking and a refusal to quit at the first plateau can actually do to a target that looked, from any reasonable outside view, completely out of reach. I think about that conversation in the doctor's office fairly often now, not with any resentment toward the assessment itself, which was honest and well-intentioned, but with a kind of quiet gratitude for what it forced me to actually build in response. Without that assessment, there would have been no reason to build the tracking system this episode has walked through. No checkpoint schedule, no written threshold for what counts as a real pattern. Being told something is unrealistic, it turns out, is sometimes exactly the pressure needed to build the specific structure that ends up proving it wrong. Not despite the discouraging assessment, but because of it. Funny how that works out, looking back on it now. This is where this book and the last one this channel spent 12 episodes on actually start to overlap most directly, even though they come from very different worlds. Extreme ownership asked whether a person was willing to own the outcome instead of the circumstances. This chapter asks something adjacent, whether a person is willing to own the actual testing of a limit, rather than accepting someone else's honest, well-informed assessment of it as the final word before ever putting it to the test themselves. That distinction matters more than it might first sound like it should. Owning the testing doesn't mean dismissing expert advice out of hand or assuming every professional assessment is automatically wrong. It means treating that assessment as exactly what it actually is, a well-informed prediction based on typical effort under typical conditions, rather than an unappealable verdict about a specific individual who hasn't yet applied the kind of atypical, obsessive effort this chapter describes. The doctor in that office wasn't wrong about what most people, under most conditions, would achieve. The only thing left open was whether this particular attempt, under these particular conditions, had to follow that same pattern, and that question was never going to get answered by accepting the prediction. It was only ever going to get answered by actually running the experiment. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice, chasing whatever's currently sitting on your own impossible list. Legs are starting to feel it now, which usually means we're close to done for today. Good place to leave this one with you. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.